Thanks for joining us either this morning or this afternoon, depending on where you're located. We're really excited to offer our 10th episode of our webinar series. This one's on the Energy Transition 2.0. We're really excited to have our panelists back. That last program we held a year and a half, 2 years ago was really well received, so we're excited about that. Upcoming webinars, if you are new to our webinar series, feel free to email me after this and let me know that you'd like to receive future communications about upcoming programs, or if you have ideas on upcoming programs, let me know.
Yeah.
I think someone might be not on mute.
Hey, Himanshu, I think you're not muted. Thank you.
Awesome, thank you. Education credits. So you can use this as an opportunity to self-report PDHs. I'll send out a certificate of completion as well as a recording of today's program following the meeting. And we also upload it on the GeoEngineers website. So if you'd like to look at previous ones and need certificates of completion for those, let me know and I'm happy to get that to you. Questions during today's webinar, we're going to be using the chat feature. Hopefully if everyone can just stay on mute, it just makes it easier. We anticipate a little bit larger crowd, so that will help with the conversation. Mark and I will be moderating that portion and making sure your questions get answered towards the end. Also, if you have questions after the presentation, let us know and we'll connect you to one of the panelists and see if we can resolve that. And then finally, we really do want you to participate and share your questions. So those who participate and add either statements, comments, questions in the chat. One of our panelists, Mark Bridges, recently suggested one of his favorite books on AI. It's called Competing in the Age of AI, and it has a really good business perspective. So we'll be sending out a few of those books as just a fun gift. As usual, and a lot of folks are in consulting or an owner, here's our disclaimer. So the views and information and opinions expressed today during our webinar by our moderator or a panelist are solely those of the individual and do not necessarily represent those of their respective organization. At GeoEngineers, we have a safety commitment to home safe every day that is for all of our staff. We do annual training as well as all of the required training, but we really push, that every one of our staff members gets home safely at the end of the day and have a lot of protocols in place to be doing check-ins. So I encourage you to do the same. Today's moderator, I think a lot of you know him, Mark Miller. He's a principal engineer and our national trenchless leader at GeoEngineers. He has, let me put someone else on mute. Okay. Oops, sorry, I'm
going the wrong way.
Yeah. He has 15 years of trenchless experience, 25 years at GeoEngineers, which is awesome. Again, he supports our national pipeline practice. He's worked on hundreds of HDD projects. The fun fact I'm putting in here is he's one of the best navigators. You can literally go to any city and he will know exactly where we're going and does not need like GPS or our map system. So here's some fun pictures from different trips where I'm like, do you know where you're going? And he's like, yes, we're fine. We're going to get there. And this is in huge cities where I have like no idea where we're at. So this is one of his many skills. So with that, Mark, I'm going to hand it over to you to introduce our panelists.
All right, thank you, April. It's called, I study maps, so I figure out where I'm going ahead of time. So anyway, today, Clay Atwood is one of our panelists. So he's the director of energy for new energy venture projects at Williams. He's got 30 years total experience, 5 years experience in the pipeline industry. He focuses primarily on project management, project development, technical business development. And for his fun fact, he loves outdoors and is currently learning to whitewater kayak, which sounds pretty cool. So, and then we have Justin Freeman. He's VP of CCUS and hydrogen at Coffman Engineers. He's located in Anchorage, Alaska. He's got 20 plus years experience. He's an expert in the energy transition, in particular in the carbon capture and hydrogen side of things. And then, his fun fact, he has his own ice rink in his backyards, and his kids actually keep it cleaned off snow with an electric snow blower. So there you go, picture of it. And then we also have Mark Bridgers, his principal at Continuum Capital. He's got 20 years of experience, 20 plus. He works primarily at gas, electric utilities, power generators, pipeline companies, energy companies to support the planning, design, and construction of capital assets. He grew up in the utility construction market, working for his father, who still refers to him as unskilled labor. Um, Continuum consults on how to put highly engineered capital construction in place and effectively as possible. So his fun fact, which I think trumps all of ours, is he escaped an airplane fire via this emergency slide. So I wish I could. I wish I had something that cool. So with that, Mark, why don't you kind of start off? You kind of developed a few slides to start things off here.
It was actually hot, as you might imagine, as the fire was burning. But I appreciate the invite to come back today, and I want to kind of set the stage for the conversation and cause everybody to begin thinking about what's going on around us. It's rare that we get the opportunity to look at the edge of the horizon and think about what the future might hold. And I chose a quote from Warren Buffett. Many of you might be familiar with him, but the quote talks about Buffett's perspectives on volatility. And so the positioning of where we are right now is that we have, post-COVID, we have exited a period of relative stability in terms of how the markets and the world and the global trade was functioning that lasted almost 40 years. And we have entered a period of volatility. And that volatility is going to look and feel more like the 1960s and the 1970s looked and felt. And so most of us in the webinar today were not senior managers, and in some instances, we're not working in the 70s and even in the 60s. And so we don't have as much experience with how to manage during these periods of volatility. And that might be frightening. It might cause us to sit still. It might cause us to think we need to slow down. But Buffett points out this idea that true opportunity only comes from volatility. And so while we've entered this period where it's going to be more volatile, there are all sorts of interesting opportunities that are going to be placed in front of us. And it's our responsibility to figure out how to seize those. April, if you'll move forward one slide. So there are some drivers of transformation that are happening around us. One of them is COVID-19 that's introduced new approaches. One of those is virtual tools for efficiencies and profit that we're using today as an example. That was relatively rare that you'd participate in a webinar prior to COVID. Now it's become routine and is frankly occurring on a daily basis. Again, this is a transformation in terms of how the industry is functioning. Geopolitical, we've got competition that's driving more onshoring. As many of you have been following, there is a manufacturing renaissance that is in the process of occurring here in the US. Much of that is manufacturing that was in China and other locations that's being brought back to the US, in some instances for strategic reasons and in other instances for tactical. This onshoring or manufacturing expansion is going to demand energy, and the vast majority of that energy is going to come from natural gas. And so this creates an opportunity for this market space as that occurs. You've got economic conditions that are changing. We're in a higher inflation-oriented environment. If you saw the quotes on the previous month's results recently, inflation has remained higher than the Federal Reserve target. That means the Federal Reserve is unlikely to reduce interest rates. That's going to keep interest rates relatively high. This is changing the whole dynamic as it relates to schedule performance and the construction of assets and financing of these assets, and how that's going to dictate what the most important criteria are in terms of hiring a construction firm, and also the most important criteria in terms of management. You've got geographic markets where new customers are being opened up. These are driven by demographic, economic, and market changes. You've got new new skills that are being integrated that tie back in, new work types and new skills that tie back into what we're going to talk about today, which is the application of CO2, the use of fuel cells, the integration of hydrogen into the natural gas system, the use of LNG. And some of you are probably tuned in to the restriction on LNG permitting that's taking place. We're going to talk a little bit about that. And then also the integration of RNG into the natural gas system. You've got workforce shifts, which is how are we going to attract and train and retain people? And you've got immigration and migration challenges. And we've got to figure out how to integrate these individuals into the workforce to address shortages that we've got. April, if you move on to the next page. So I want to set this idea with you that one of the paths, and frankly, perhaps the only path to a green energy future, is figuring out how to deal with three gases. One, natural gas as a clean fuel to replace coal and to augment wind and solar renewables, and to create something that looks more like dispatchable power. Natural gas also can be paired with storage at or near the renewable generation point. You've got carbon dioxide as a capture result from various forms of power generation or manufacturing to dramatically reduce carbon emissions. We'll talk a little bit about the Navigator pipeline, CO2 pipeline project today. And then lastly, hydrogen as a clean fuel, as a storage tool, and as a method to avoid stranded pipeline and distribution assets. If we can figure out how to adapt to these three gases and apply them in the most efficient and effective way in the U.S., we will be well on the path to a green future. April? So just to give you a couple of insights into some of the things that are going on around us, these are some quotes from a Wall Street Journal article that was published about 2 weeks ago. And this speaks to kind of what our future is going to look like. And so this idea of total electrification is something that we're probably not going to be able to stop. And frankly, it's something we have to figure out how to embrace. This creates an opportunity for us because much of the need for power from the concept of total electrification is going to have to come from natural gas. As an example, in Georgia, you're seeing industrial power demand for new attachments to their system projected to be 17 times higher over the next decade. In Arizona, you've got a situation where transmission capacity, because of power demand, is going to be outstripped by 2030. In Virginia, you've got the need for several large nuclear power facilities in order to serve the demand for power that is primarily being driven by the construction of data centers. Again, that power is going to have to be served by natural gas. And then you've got soaring power consumption in the Midwest and in South Carolina that is delaying the closure of coal plants. And again, that's going to have to be addressed by natural gas. And so these are all things that are in our future. The last thing I want you to leave you with is this idea of artificial intelligence. And so artificial intelligence is going to be the most transformative force that we are going to experience over the next decade. Each of the items that I've talked through up to this point are definitely going to transform the industry, but this idea of artificial intelligence is even going to do that more so. And there's an analogy back in the late 1800s when the Luddites, who were followers and appropriated the name of Ned Ludd, were destroying weaving equipment in England because of the fear of technology integrated into what prior to that point had been primarily a manual process. The applications of AI from a business standpoint are going to create that same type of disruption. And so I position this question for you. Are you going to be a Luddite and look forward and hope that we can return to the past? Or are you going to embrace this transformation and figure out how to use it?
Did we lose him?
No, back. So
Okay.
said this book that's listed on the right that April mentioned, this is a particularly good book that I found. It is not a book about math or statistics that underlie the use of AI. It is not a book about the technology that makes AI function. It is a book about how to apply AI as a tool for business. And so I think it's something that each of you that are looking at the applications of AI in your business might consider this book as a starting point. It's kind of a 101 that helps you get your head wrapped around how this might influence and impact your business. With that said, I'm going to hand it back over to Mark, and we'll begin the panel discussion.
Great. Thanks, Mark. I think April's going to spotlight us. While she does that, that was a great introduction, by the way. So I guess the rest of our discussion here is just to kind of get an understanding of where we're at in the state of industry on these three gases: natural gas, carbon capture, CCUS, and hydrogen, and kind of where's the industry, what are the opportunities, let's say, for engineering firms, construction firms, things like that. Just kind of, let's just start with natural gas. You placed a big emphasis on that, Mark. In our industry, in our business here, we're seeing a lot of projects related to expansion, related to basically getting natural gas to LNG plants. So that, that's driving a lot of pipeline infrastructure, a lot of construction. We're also seeing, you mentioned some of these power needs on the East Coast. We're seeing a fair amount of expansion of natural gas pipelines in the Mid-Atlantic region. So, I kind of agree that, there's natural gas isn't going anywhere. Clay, I think you had mentioned previously, and I read about this, but don't know a lot about it, but certified natural gas. Do you want to kind of give us a little bit of idea of what that's about? Clay, are you there? Oh, is he muted?
Apparently there's two unmutes. So
I was like, don't leave me hanging.
So yeah, so where we are in this space is that we're looking at all three of the gases: natural gas, hydrogen, and CO2. So one of the things that we're looking at is, if you take a look at all of the forecast, the amount of renewable energy coming in is less than the forecast for all of the energy needs that are going forward. So we're seeing that a growth in natural gas just across the board. So when we take a look at like hydrogen or CO2, it really plays into a bigger kind of a portfolio of projects for us, where we're taking a look at certified natural gas. And certified natural gas is basically, we can validate what the carbon intensity of the natural gas is along our entire value chain, our supply chain. So we invested in a company called Context Labs probably 2 years ago, and they've been doing that validation using some blockchain technology. So when we say certified natural gas, it doesn't mean that it's low carbon intensity or anything like that. It's just we can validate what that carbon intensity is at any point in the pipeline. So the way we're seeing this work out is that there's a lot of times where we're saying we want green or we want blue or something like that. What we're saying is we don't really care what the energy molecule is. We're very agnostic on the energy molecule. But what we are interested in is showing that our energy that we're providing is competitive or lower than other, our competitors' natural gas. So that's kind of what we're looking at, is how can we validate what that energy or the carbon content is for that amount of energy.
Sounds like quite an undertaking.
Well, it's taken a while, and it's and when you got about a third of the natural gas throughout the United States going through your pipelines, it takes a lot of work to get that done. It also takes a lot of computational power, which one of the things that I think Mark had talked about earlier was the AI. One of the things we're seeing is that an AI search takes about 10 to 15 times the amount of energy as a regular Google search. So as this AI starts coming on board, you're going to start seeing a bigger need for energy, whether that could be nuclear, that could be solar, wind, natural gas. But we think natural gas is going to be playing a big part of the future.
Great, thank you. Do you have anything down on that, Mark? You're muted too, by the way.
Yeah, no, I think Clay's right on target. As you look forward, there was a period of time, probably in 2010 or 12, where it looked like that, based on the forecast, that the demand for power was going to continue to decelerate, and utilities were going to have to figure out how to turn off power generation facilities in order to match the power output with the power demand. Well, that's not going to be a problem going forward. The problem going forward is going to be, where are we going to get the power in order to service the demand for it? And so one of the quotes that I've been reading about, there's a requirement in California to get all the gas-fired and diesel-fired vehicles off the road by 2035. And the amount of power that would be demanded in order to accomplish that would potentially be 3 to 5 times the amount of power that's currently utilized in California today. And so you've got a situation where there's not that much spare power in the Pacific, in the West. And so you're going to have to, if that actually occurs, you're going to have to construct more power generation in order to accomplish that. And so those types of questions are showing up everywhere. And Clay's exactly right. the amount of energy demanded for the use of AI is a multiplier versus kind of standard computer sourcing and data analysis. And so that's going to also be a driver, because again, AI is going to become something that's routine and used day in, day out for average people. It's not going to be something that's just for certain companies or at a certain level. It's going to be used by everybody.
Yeah, thanks. You know, one of the things I believe you mentioned earlier was this this hold on LNG export permits, Mark. You know, we've got a client who's trying to get the approvals to build an LNG plant, and as of right now, you know, they don't see it as being a problem, at least at this moment. You know, for them, they get their FERC certificate, they can at least construct their plant even when they don't have an export license. I'm just kind of curious, kind of, if anybody, Justin, I'm sorry I haven't called on you. If you have anything to say, go ahead, pipe in there on this subject. But Mark, I'll leave it to you first, and then maybe if Justin has something to say. Sorry.
Yeah, but there's kind of two perspectives. There's what I'll say is, you know, my business perspective on it, and then there's my political perspective on it. And so my political perspective is that my belief is that this is simply a way to encourage voters to use the restrictions in the LNG permits to make a voting decision. From a business standpoint, you know, the concept of restricting these permits is designed to try to strangle the use of natural gas. And these facilities are primarily export facilities that would potentially deliver gas around the globe. When you look at how gas is extracted in the U.S. versus the other major producers of gas, you're talking about the Russians, the Middle Eastern countries. The U.S. is by far the cleanest and the most efficient extractor, and we actually have the lowest cost point for accessing natural gas versus any of the global competitors. And so from those standpoints, from a business standpoint, the market is going to demand that product. And so the question becomes, is it something that we stop from a political standpoint? Is it something that we stop from a climate perspective standpoint? Is it something that gets stopped because of market perspectives? And so our view is that this is something that is going to end up getting undone and going to be reversed, because there is market demand for this product, and the product has cost competitive advantages that could be applied around the globe. And frankly, as a geopolitical support for the U.S. if it were implemented, if it were reversed as well.
Okay, thank you. Justin, did you have anything on that?
Yeah, just a couple of things. And, you know, I think that, you know, living in Alaska, it's kind of feels like you're living in Europe a little bit there with the, you know, energy cost. You know, I just checked the Henry Hub and just was floored that it's $1.38 today. And that's not the price that I pay, right? It's not the price that the Europeans pay, but I think it highlights the national security associated with cheap and affordable natural gas. And I think part of that reshoring of manufacturing, where we have access to cheap energy. And but I think in the future, there's going to be a demand that also needs to be lower carbon intensity, kind of as Clay was talking about, that certified, you know, ability to understand what is the carbon intensity of that methane molecule. And the other way to think about it too is, you know, natural gas can be used in other processes like steam methane reforming or pyrolysis to, you know, create hydrogen as an input to that process. So it's not only for the power generation, but also as a feedstock into other industrial processes. And lastly, you know, as people are talking about the grid and decarbonizing grid, I think that the guys have made a great point of, you know, when I was talking to a utility, it's like, you can't be thinking about trying to decarbonize your power demand today because of the AI and then all of the electric vehicles that are coming on, you know, to the grid and basically trying to electrify homes. So it's not just about trying to decarbonize our power generation grid today. It's about what does that look like in the future? And the United States is only one part of this equation. We're trying to figure out how to decarbonize the energy system of the world, which is a staggering problem.
Thanks, Justin. I think with that, you know, that's a great discussion on natural gas, I thought. Let's move on to CO2, carbon capture. Mark, you want to give kind of a little bit of a maybe I don't know, history lesson or discuss the fate of the Navigator project, which we had done some preliminary work on. Go ahead.
Yeah, so the other review I've been following it, the Navigator project has been canceled at this point, and the Summit Carbon Solutions project is continuing. And then Valero has joined a partnership with Summit in order to try to push that project forward. Those of you who were studying that, the area of the country where Navigator and Summit were planning to build that pipeline were basically in the same essential geography. And so there's an argument to be made that there wasn't space for both of those pipelines. And so it was my personal view that one of them was going to become victorious, in the pursuit. And it appears that Summit is that one. And the partnership with Valero, pushes that project forward. But there are still substantial obstacles that are in the way that revolve around permitting and right-of-way and easement requirements. And one of the beliefs that I had looking backwards in time was that there was pushback on the construction of pipeline because of the product that was in it. The Summit Carbon Solutions job, of course, would have carbon dioxide in it, which is a completely different product, and frankly is designed to remove carbon release into the atmosphere. And it would be kind of the opposite of putting a petroleum product into a pipeline. And I was a believer that pipeline would get more support in the geographies where it was going to be constructed. But it does not appear that that's the case at this point. And so this is a problem that Summit is going to have to figure out how to solve, which is to get people warmed up to the idea that this is part of the path to a green future. And these types of projects are safe, are reliable, and can be constructed at reasonable cost and supported by business economics.
Thanks, Mark. Justin, I know when we had some previous conversation on this topic, you had some kind of insight on, some of the, opposition's, say misinformation of some of these projects.
Yeah, I think it's, it was surprising to me that, a lot of the NGOs, I thought this would be a confluence of interests, but, there's a lot of folks that are trying to use maybe some scare tactics, and, there's sprinkling of just enough information of some truths with some stuff that is maybe exaggerated. And then just kind of building on Mark's point of highlighting that we've been, moving CO2 around this country for a long time, very safely. Industry knows how to do this. We can get the right material specifications where we're protecting against, water dropping out and having, carbonic acid issues and rapid corrosion. Like we as a country have a very safe and long history of moving CO2. And but I think that there's an education component there of, where are the real dangers, right? It is a heavier gas, it does settle out in low-lying areas, but I think that process of public engagement, and then as we're getting different types of CO2 that are being connected to networks, as we're doing direct air capture or post-combustion capture, like setting the standards that we have established nationwide standards that we can all understand what we're trying to build and build that standardization into our procurement processes and engineering, so we don't have to keep solving this problem of like what's the right material specifications. And I think there's a lot of progress being made in that space.
So essentially each emitter would have to scrub their own emissions to get the CO2 to a spec that agreed upon spec for the particular system.
Yep.
Did you have anything to add, Clay?
Yeah, one of the things that the Pipeline Research Council, they came up with, I guess, 3 different work streams, and then they said, well, let's add a fourth. It was actually gap 0, which is how do you quantify the different constituents inside these different gas streams. So if you've got something like coming from a landfill, you may have some things like formaldehyde or arsenic or heavy metals that you may need to strip out. You get something from a cement plant or something like that. Those are going to be completely different. I know the DOE has just started a research topics on how do you quantify these different streams so that we can say this is the requirement, and we can go to the processors and say, how do you strip that out to get it to the quality that you need? But without knowing what the constituents are at the beginning, it's kind of hard to develop that process.
I gotcha. Gus, I know one thing that there's one thing about capturing, getting CO2 to a particular specification, putting into a pipeline, but then putting it in the ground. I know there's been some regulatory hurdles from an injection well standpoint. I think it was I think in 3 states, Wyoming, North Dakota, and just recently Louisiana were given primacy on, the permitting for these injection wells. And I think just like right after that, Louisiana, what primacy means is that the state can actually permit the wells rather than having to be a federal process. And I think right after Louisiana got theirs, some environmental groups basically filed a suit within the state, I guess. So there's a lot of pushback in that end of things too. I think you had some stuff to say about that.
Yeah, most of the wells that have been injecting CO2, for the last 40, 50 plus years have been related to, enhanced oil recovery. So that falls under the Class 2 process. Whereas the Class 6 process is purely for wells that are injecting geological, or CO2 into geological formations, typically saline aquifers. And, there's a very extremely robust process where you got a lot of smart geologists that are a lot smarter than I am are doing the earth models, and they're doing the dynamic simulation to understand how the CO2 plume is going to go through the reservoir. And they're doing the monitoring with the basically the reservoir sort of safety space up above the seal or the cap rock. And so there's extremely robust process to ensure that CO2 is not going to stay there for the next 10 years, but it's going to stay there for the next 100 years, 1,000 years, until it basically turns into a rock itself. And it's some pretty complex science, and a lot of PhD folks that are working in that space, but there's a robust permitting process to ensure that the due diligence has been done for those wells to be approved. And last time I counted on the EPA site, there's now 43 Class 6 EPA wells that are under permitting right now today. And so it's gaining momentum. It's gaining some critical mass. And I think that, again, it comes back to a little bit of some public education where it's like, we're not injecting this into the groundwater underneath your house. This is being injected a mile down, and the right due diligence has been done to ensure that we really are going to put this in a spot that's not going to be in seismic zones, or it's going to not be in places that is going to cause problems for the generations that follow after us.
And thanks, Clay. We had a question come in here about basically asking, thank you for the interesting subject. Is there any update from PHMSA regarding new regulations for CO2 pipelines that you're aware of? That you work for a pipeline operator, maybe Justin too, maybe that may be a good question for you as well.
I have not heard anything. In fact, I just was on a panel last week with someone from PHMSA, and they've really been looking at industry to provide the direction, the guidance, because they're walking a fine line between putting regulations in place and allowing and not blocking off creativity. So they're really trying to walk that line between there, and they're looking at the industry to come up with the general solutions, and then they're going to codify those solutions as they go. So I haven't seen anything here recently, but I've seen them take a more of a wait and see approach for where we're going right now.
Okay. Yeah, and to follow on to some, Mark talked about Navigator and Summit just a little bit. We have been seeing quite a few CO2 pipeline projects in the Gulf Coast region, which, I think in that region maybe makes a little bit more sense from an economic standpoint to build out in that area, because you have a lot of emitters, you have a lot of existing pipeline corridors, things are easier to permit from a regulatory standpoint in the Gulf Coast area. And so I think, what we're seeing is the Exxons, the Chevrons, the big players in the industry really jump on that. And I think, there's basically a race for these credits. There's, I think the only way that makes carbon sequestration anyway financially feasible is through subsidies, and it's through these carbon credits, right? So, I know there's a lot of criticism. I see some of this in the questions. There were some pre-questions. I'm just kind of curious of the tax credit situation, Justin. I think you may be a bit more versed in kind of how those tax credits work.
Yeah. Well, one point, just kind of building on what you're saying there, Mark. I mean, one of the reasons the Gulf Coast, I mean, is such an attractive place, right, is that you have large land blocks as well that are basically the state land and the federal land, because there generally is no mechanism to force pool land positions where you have a diversity of the surface landowners that then own the geology. And so that really, helps from a Gulf of Mexico standpoint. But
You're talking about like mineral rights, like in Texas, you don't own the mineral rights,
right.
so yeah, okay.
You can create, there's a pooling mechanism, right, where you can basically create, units that are multiple working interest owners, but there is no process for that generally in any of the states to do that for Class 6 wells. And so that's the attractive part of going to the Gulf of Mexico, because you're just dealing with the state of Texas or you're dealing with the feds. And so you have one basically pore space owner. But yeah, we don't have a cost of carbon, right? And that's one of the things that is making this much more complex, is if we had a rules-based system where you had a cost of carbon, you could just let the market figure that out, and you could, indicate that price is going to increase through the decades ahead and businesses could plan, but we don't. So what we tried to do is incentivize this with tax credits. And so that is a start, right? But it does drive some really interesting projects that are maybe not the best use of taxpayers to decarbonize our energy system. But not all cost of carbon is equal. The reason you see the ethanol plants is because they emit pure or CO2 today. So the only cost is to do that compression and dehydration, versus a power plant that's burning natural gas. That CO2 is about 4%. So you are doing a massive amount of capital investment and some very, capital intensive, and that generally every single time we've been helping companies try to navigate this, it's very uneconomic, right? You're talking about an asset that's maybe been around 30, 40 years, and you're going to put in a $500 million to $1 billion capture facility. That generally doesn't work. And so, maybe there's new build that, has like an alum cycle that's designed for carbon capture. But, the tax credits are what they are. They are what we have. And then we have a lot of the DOE funding that's doing some of the matching with the DOE hubs and the carbon capture plants. But it's kind of an imperfect system right now.
Yeah, I mean, I know there's a lot of, we had one question, I don't have it in front of me, but it was basically saying that, these projects, since they can't, they would never survive in a free market system, and what happens right now, they're kind of surviving on subsidies, right, to make these projects happen. What happens when the administration changes, let's say, and the next administration says, you know what, we're just not gonna do this, and so I guess from the money that has been allocated for these types of things, I mean, how much time, let's say if the next administration says, no, we're not going to fund that anymore, does that cut off funding immediately, or is this money already kind of legislated, going to be spent regardless of what the administration says?
Yeah, I was talking to somebody about this just 2 days ago, and this has been approved, right? It's been allocated. I mean, it's got some momentum that's would be very hard to unwind.
Okay.
So I think these hubs are going to go through regardless of the administration that's in place. But I think part of the question with this hub money is, if you're only getting 30% cost share, but your project is being extended by 3-4 years because you're following a DOE gated process, there's indirect costs and increases of your project costs that you could see your project be delayed effectively by 3 years. And it's kind of you haven't gotten any benefit from a cost standpoint, because you had an extended duration to basically follow a really robust process. And the DOE is trying to do that because they're trying to protect our taxpayer dollars and make sure they're funding good projects. So it's a hard balance, right?
All right. Yeah.
There's two components to that. There's actually an analogy in the broadband market where the federal government has allocated a significant amount of money. It's going to probably double or triple the amount of spend that's happening in broadband construction in the US. And that money is totally for the construction of new assets in rural areas. But you've got two problems. The first problem is you have to get the asset constructed. The second problem is you have to be able to operate it profitably. And so the operating profitably ties back into the question that Justin was speaking to. We've got to both be able to build these facilities, and then we've got to be able to operate them. And so there has to be a market, there has to be pricing, there have to be, some regulatory support, there has to be market support. And a lot of these are unanswered questions, in the short term. And frankly, investment money is designed to make bets on concepts like this. Is there going to be a market for carbon in the future that sets the price that we can count on and use that as a way to fund the financing of this type of project over the long term? And those questions are not fully answered yet, but people are prepared to bet on that.
Thanks, Mark. Well, since you're talking, let's kind of make a little segue to hydrogen. There's, I guess, we were going to kind of explain the difference between green and blue hydrogen, and something through this process. I had no idea that there's actually 8 different colors of hydrogen. We won't get into all of those. Maybe just
there's actually more than 8.
Oh, okay. That's only 8 on this list. So sorry. I'm not up with the times, evidently.
Yeah, in the simplest sense, what the colors of hydrogen are supposed to define is how was the hydrogen created. So as an example, if you separate water molecule, you get hydrogen and oxygen. And so that's one of the classes of colors. There are other chemical processes that separate hydrogen from some other molecule that then, the hydrogen can be captured. And so the concept there is to really try to understand what is the source of the hydrogen. And I think it was Clay that was alluding to this before, but different facilities produce different amounts of carbon as an emission. And so some types of facilities are carbon intensive carbon dioxide intensive in terms of their release. Other facilities are releasing carbon dioxide, but it's a much smaller percentage of the release. The same thing is true from a hydrogen standpoint. What is the source of the hydrogen, and what is the benefit of separating that hydrogen molecule from what it was connected to, and then understanding what the additional benefit is from that? And so most people are focused on how would we use hydrogen in an efficient way? But there's 2 parts of this question. What benefit do we get by separating hydrogen from some other molecule? And then secondly, how do we use hydrogen in a more efficient fashion? And that's really what the colors are trying to speak to.
Clay, did you have anything to add to that?
No, I did. I think Mark said it pretty well. We are looking at different, again, we're agnostic on the molecule. If it's a carbon molecule, or not carbon, methane molecule, or a hydrogen molecule, it doesn't really matter for us. But I agree with Mark, and I think that's where we start splitting the hydrogen off of an existing molecule. You say, what is the end use of that? What problem are you trying to solve? And typically what I hear is that we're going to use electrolysis to break a water molecule apart to burn hydrogen to create electricity. And you say, well, that's a very inefficient process. So unless you're going to use it for, let's say, storage, like chemical energy storage, or the mobility sector, or use it for like sustainable aviation fuel, more complex molecules, then it really doesn't make sense to create, use electricity to break it apart to create electricity.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And to put a finer point on that, wind power, as an example, is one of the green energy solutions here in the US, but wind in most parts of the US is intermittent power. And the problem is there are some portions of time during the 24-hour day that wind power is being produced, and there's not enough demand for the power that's being produced in certain parts of the country. And so one of the options is to use the wind power as a power source for electrolysis, as Clay was describing, to separate hydrogen from oxygen. And then basically the hydrogen becomes the storage facility for the power that's being produced by wind energy. And then that hydrogen would, in theory, be interjected into the natural gas system and moved around the country as a way to displace the burning of a methane molecule with the burning of a hydrogen molecule. there is terrific upside associated with doing something like that from a green standpoint, but it requires the pipeline infrastructure and tying that with the wind power infrastructure. And then, of course, public support for all of that is critical as well.
Thanks, Mark. Yeah, I'd been reading some articles that, there's kind of been a little bit of headbutting between the Department of Energy and Treasury on who's going to qualify or how you're going to qualify for these hydrogen credits. And, it seems like, environmentalists are very, very adamant that, the hydrogen has to be, created with very low or zero carbon emissions, right? And, it seems like the DOE kind of is favoring more towards the producer side, saying, hey, look, we're not going to get enough investment in this type of technology if we're too stringent to begin with. It's maybe have a staged set of, if you want to qualify for these tax credits, okay, maybe you have to meet this bar now, but maybe it gets more stringent down the road. So it still seems like there's some regulatory, some tax or maybe incentive credits that still need to be worked out before some of the money really gets to the producers, the people will be producing this eventually. Did have one question. This question says, I've heard about studies for hydrogen blending and transmission systems. Are studies also being done in distribution systems? Now, Justin, I know we talked a little bit about some of the more technical issues with, I think maybe Clay, you might be able to weigh in on maybe some of the more technical challenges with hydrogen and pipeline systems in general.
Clay, you want to tackle the pipeline and I'll go next?
Sure. So yeah, the answer is yes, there's not a lot of difference between the distribution and the transmission. The transmission is the harder one to do because you're at higher pressure. One of the things we keep having people ask is, well, what percent blend is okay? Well, what we're finding is we did studies at, I think Sandia National Labs did studies for 100%, 10%, and 1%. They found that 1%, 100% on the embrittlement is about the same. We did some research down to 0.25%. And so the majority of the damage, there's about 20% reduction in your toughness from 0 to 0.25%. And then it just pretty much flat lines to 100%. So what we're finding though is the pressure is the big driver. So if you can stay below 50% SMICE on your pipeline, you're fine. So the distribution pipelines, if you take a look at all of the ones that are currently being discussed right now, I don't think there's any that are currently being discussed in works that are above 50% SMICE. Everything else is below 50% SMICE, which is basically distribution pressures. So
some distribution, maybe a lot of distribution lines in urban areas these days are HDPE, right? So is there any sort of problem with that?
We've seen some studies about blistering on the pipelines, but we haven't seen a lot of problems with the HDPE as long as it can handle the pressure.
Okay, right on. Justin, you had some additional things?
Yeah, I mean, I think that a lot of, if you just kind of focus on the green hydrogen, it tends to be a little bit more looking at some of the local market, right? And so you kind of have this, what's the demand, and there's not a lot of demand right now, right? And so you kind of have this chicken egg thing, because you need to design your logistics and your infrastructure around what's your customer's demand versus, your production. And so trying to find that balance, and what then turns into, are you trying to do cryogenic, which is very energy intensive, right? High pressure tube trailers, or even metal hydrate, which is sort of an emerging technology to store hydrogen. And but you really kind of have to understand the customer demand, and that customer demand is pretty nascent right now, unless you're just trying to displace existing industrial large scale users that are using it for refineries and things of that nature. So
Bridgers, did you have anything to add? Yeah, there's one question here too. It says, with the recent challenges with hydrogen, how do you see hydrogen going on in the next 5 years or growing in the next 5 years. And I think, I think it faces a lot of challenges in a lot of different, a lot of different places. So it doesn't seem to me that you're probably going to see a lot of that soon, if I had to guess.
Can I add a little bit to that? One of the things that I've been seeing is like High Blend 1, they had 50 companies supporting that. And then whenever they went to High Blend 2 for their second phase, 20 of the 50 re-engaged with that. So 30 of the 50 decided not to support High Blend 2. I think people are seeing the difficulty of hydrogen, and mainly because there's not a real market for it right now. And so until we get a market, there's going to be a lot of reticence to put a lot of capital into the system until we can get someone that's actually going to take the molecule. We have a lot of people who want to do the attributes and all of that kind of stuff and do all the trading, but not very many people want to take the molecule at this point.
Yeah, and actually, Justin, I know at one point you had mentioned that, because it's less energy dense hydrogen, that, mixing it into methane at whatever percent, you end up having to think about end users, right? If you have a furnace that is expecting something with a certain energy density, well, now your 100,000 BTU furnace is only putting out 80 or whatever, if it's for an industrial process. So, it's not just, oh, we'll just put hydrogen in there and we'll solve, we'll reduce our carbon footprint.
Well, and kind of go back to some of the earlier comments too, right? And, if you can use the electron, use the electron, right? And if you're talking about, 4-hour backup power, like battery storage is going to be more cost competitive in that niche, right? You're looking at the explosion of, a lot of the electric vehicles and the very small, and some of the troubles that California's having now with the hydrogen fuel cell vehicles. And, but I'm seeing, some uses with like transit bus authorities, right, that are maybe struggling with some of their EV fleet. And, we worked on a citywide backup power for basically a large scale microgrid. And they were using a combination of a battery storage with hydrogen fuel cell to, go beyond that 4 to 6 hours at the batteries, where you're going to need multi-day storage, right? And so it's an emerging sort of market on the hydrogen use case. And I think that it eventually over the next decade, it'll settle out like what's the right use case for hydrogen in the energy mix. But it's not going to be that everything and all for all applications, but it's going to have its place.
Gotcha. Yeah, so I guess, we're getting down to about 6 minutes left. And one of the questions we got was, where do the panelists think the industry will be in 10 years from today? And what are the main hurdles to overcome, to get there, be it technology, regulatory? You could probably throw in the financial issues, the funding of this. I'd seen an article I think it was from last week. JP Morgan, one of their head of global energy strategy, was just saying that, interest rates are much higher, government debt significantly greater, geopolitical landscape is significantly different. There's a lot of challenges to a lot of these things, right? And who knows how things are going to turn out in 10 years. But I don't know if anyone wants to kind of give their impression of where things might be. You're muted, Mark, I think, or I can't hear you for one thing.
Yeah, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yeah, I said it's going to be different.
Very succinct answer. I like it.
So the challenge is, you've got all these forces that resist prediction. So as an example, if we were looking at simply the market and the physical forces, so what is the supply of natural gas? What is the supply of oil? What is the demand for natural gas? What is the demand for oil? Those market characteristics can be predicted with relatively high accuracy in the scheme of things. What cannot be predicted is the public response, the political rhetoric, the regulatory actions. And so those are the things that are going to prove disruptive. And so when I opened up the conversation, I'm positioning this idea that we've exited a period of relative stability and entered a period of relative volatility. And so in the simplest sense, I don't think it's possible to predict where we're going to be in 10 years. I just know it's likely to be very different than where we are currently.
Justin, you're Clay, you gonna add anything?
I'll put my 2 cents on this. Again, I like Mark, the crystal ball starts getting pretty murky at 10-year mark, but I do believe that natural gas is still going to be a very big player in that space. And one of the things that we talk about primarily is electrolysis for creating hydrogen, because pyrolysis really hasn't become really got through the technology readiness levels, but I think we're getting close to that. And if we get to the point where pyrolysis actually works, what we're going to see is our existing infrastructure is going to remain the same. We're going to be putting methane and putting point solutions close to the customer so they can pick whatever blend they want. That's one of the things we keep seeing with is that we don't want you to put in 5%, because if we design our system for 5% and you go to 10%, now we're obsolete. So what our customers want is a pure stream of hydrogen. And so if we can create a system where there's a pure stream of methane going to them, and then they can use electrolysis to get whatever blend they want, that's going to be what I think the long-term solution is going to be. But the biggest hurdle is permitting. Right now, everything, I keep saying that all roads lead to new pipelines. It's the most efficient way to transport energy. And we're already maxed out right now, and our demand is going up. So even if we go to hydrogen, because it's 1/3 as dense from an energy standpoint, you're going to have more pipelines to get that hydrogen down the pipeline system. So everything leads to more pipelines in our system.
Thank you, Clay. Justin.
Yeah, I think 10 years, I think it's going to be lower carbon intensity from the energy system. I think that is going to be one of the trends. I do think that there's going to be more localized energy production when it comes to hydrogen, using some of that excess renewable. And I think the other thing too is that, the United States and Europe are on a declining emission trend, right? Whereas you got to think about, this is not an American problem we're trying to solve. This is a world problem we're trying to solve. And China is over 11 billion tons. India, is increasing about 3 billion tons. And there's still less on a per capita basis in terms of the people energy use, right? But I think some type of system and framework has got to get in place from a world economy that somehow the carbon intensity of your products needs to matter, right? And so that ability to measure your carbon intensity of your value chain is going to become incredibly important.
Thank you. Well, I think we're about 1 minute to go. I think that ended kind of at perfect time. I don't know that I have any closing comments other than to thank the three of you for joining us for this kind of second go around of this discussion about kind of where the industry is with regards to, like I said, when I look at this, I look at, what are opportunities in the engineering construction space. There's a lot of discussion we could have had about, some of the electrification and some of the opportunities in undergrounding transmission lines, for instance. We're seeing a lot of that too. So, there's a lot of, when it just comes to energy as a whole, there's so many different aspects to it that, you can't cover it all in an hour. So, but April, do you want to close us out?
Yeah, well, thank you to all of you, Mark, Clay, and Justin, for joining us today and taking an hour out of today and also the prep to get to this point. If you're on the call and you have ideas on future topics, if you think we should do an extension of this or anything in particular related to this, also let me know. And I'll be sending out a recording of today's meeting as well as the certificate of completion by tomorrow or Thursday at the latest. And we're just really thankful that you were here. So thanks for joining us, and continue to follow along on our future webinars. So take care.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.